Get over yourself! The words cracked through the grocery store louder than the beeping registers. A woman's hand shot forward, shoving a cart into the back of an old man's legs. He stumbled, one hand clutching his cane, the other bracing against the counter as a loaf of bread nearly slid to the floor. Fluorescent lights hummed above, their cold glow sharpening every crease of his face. His cap, stitched with the word veteran in faded gold thread, dipped low as he steadied himself. He did not answer. His lips pressed shut. His shoulders stiffened. A child in the next line stared wide-eyed, clutching their mother's sleeve. The air around the registers grew tight, the shuffle of carts and chatter falling into an uneasy hush. The woman's voice rose again, sharper, cutting through the silence. "Some of us have lives to live. Move faster!" The old man's cane trembled faintly in his grip. He stood his ground, silent, unflinching. And then, from deeper in the store, a figure paused mid-step, watching. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The store bustled with the everyday rhythm of late afternoon. Shopping carts rattled across the tiles, children whined for candy, and the steady chorus of beeping registers carried over the aisles. Yet at checkout lane 4, the scene felt different. The atmosphere was strained, stretched tight by the confrontation that had just cut through the noise. Customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between the entitled woman and the elderly man she had shoved, but no one moved to interfere. Thomas Garrison steadied himself against the cart, his knuckles pale around the curve of the handle. His hip ached from the sudden jolt, a sharp reminder of a fracture that had never healed right. Still, his balance held. He straightened slowly, adjusting his cap with deliberate precision. The brim shadowed his face, but those who looked closely could see the lines etched deep across his brow, carved by years of strain and sun. His silence was not weakness, it was habit, the old discipline of a man who had endured storms far greater than this. Inside his cart, the contents were simple: a loaf of bread, 2 cans of soup, a bag of apples, and a carton of milk. No indulgence, no excess. He always shopped on Thursdays, always the same aisle, always choosing carefully for price and weight. Half of these groceries were not even for himself. Each week he carried food to his neighbor, a widow who had no family left and could not walk the distance to the store. Thomas never told her how much the carrying strained his knees, or how the climb up her porch stairs left his breath short. He only left the bag at her door and tipped his cap before walking away. Now he stood in line, his hand trembling faintly as he reached for his wallet. The movement was slow, deliberate, like everything he did. His right hand never quite closed fully, 2 fingers stiffened by an old injury. Coins sometimes slipped from his grasp, clattering embarrassingly to the floor. He had learned to prepare in advance, counting out exact change before stepping to the register. But today, the shove had shaken him, scattering the rhythm of his ritual. The woman in line behind him exhaled loudly, arms folded, her nails tapping against her sleeve in a rhythm of irritation. "If you can't keep up, don't come shopping during rush hour," she repeated, her voice sharp enough to make the cashier flinch. She shifted her weight, glaring at him as though his slowness were a personal offense. Her cart overflowed with convenience meals, bottled soda, and snacks piled high. Her presence was loud in every sense of the word. Her size, her voice, her posture, all demanding attention. Thomas did not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on his cart, his breath controlled, steady as if marching in formation. He placed the bread on the counter first, aligning it neatly, then the soup, setting each can beside the other as though the order mattered. He had always done this. In the service, even under fire, he had learned that precision was its own form of calm. A man who could place each tool, each item, exactly where it belonged was a man who did not surrender to chaos. Around him, whispers began. A teenager with earbuds leaned toward his friend, muttering something that made the others smirk. A man 2 carts back grumbled under his breath about delays, shaking his head as he checked his watch. A young mother tightened her grip on her child's hand, turning her gaze deliberately toward the candy shelf, unwilling to engage. The atmosphere prickled with unease, the way air thickens before a storm. Thomas's wallet slipped slightly in his hand. The leather was cracked, edges frayed from decades of use. He gripped it tighter, forcing the tremor in his fingers under control. His movements were slow but determined, never rushed. Behind him, the woman groaned dramatically, rolling her eyes to the people around her. "Unbelievable," she muttered, her voice pitched just loud enough to be heard. Holding up the line for bread and soup, the cashier, a young man barely in his 20s, swallowed hard. His hands hovered nervously over the scanner, his eyes darting between Thomas and the woman. He wanted to say something, but his training pulled him back into neutrality. No conflict, no escalation. Keep the line moving. That was the rule. He forced a polite smile and asked quietly, "Sir, do you need a bag for these?" Thomas lifted his gaze just enough to meet the cashier's eyes. His voice came low, measured, carrying more weight than volume. "Yes, one bag." He did not explain. He did not apologize. He simply answered. The cashier nodded quickly, fumbling with the plastic roll. The line crept forward at its slow pace, yet every second stretched longer than the last. The woman's impatience radiated through the aisle like static electricity, infecting those behind her. A sigh here, a shake of the head there. People who did not know Thomas Garrison, who had never walked a mile in his boots, judged him with each passing moment. Still, he stood steady. His cane tapped softly once against the tile floor, an unconscious rhythm he had carried from the drill field into old age. His stance, though frail to some eyes, carried the memory of a soldier who had once dropped into jungle darkness, parachute billowing overhead, rifle in hand. His silence was not surrender. It was endurance. The child in the next lane tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why is she yelling at him?" The mother shushed the child quickly, glancing nervously toward the scene, then back at her own groceries. But the question lingered in the air, unspoken, yet present. Why indeed? The woman behind Thomas adjusted her stance again, leaning closer, her finger jabbing toward his shoulder, though she had not touched him yet. Her voice rose, loud enough for half the store to hear. "You people think the world owes you something. Well, it doesn't. Hurry up." Her words rang sharp, echoing across the aisles. Thomas placed the apples gently on the counter, one by one, their skins gleaming under the harsh light. His hands shook slightly, but he aligned them carefully, as though each piece of fruit deserved the same care as the last. His breathing slowed, deepened. The woman's voice cut at him, but he did not respond. His silence was his shield. The cashier's eyes darted to the manager's desk across the floor. The manager looked up but did not move, his hand frozen halfway to a clipboard. Even those in authority seemed caught in the stillness, waiting for something to break the moment open. And in the pause that followed, a quiet shift rippled through the room. Not everyone was willing to look away. Somewhere beyond the registers, a figure stopped walking, shoulders squared, eyes steady, their attention fixed now on lane 4. Something was about to change. The line crawled forward, the sound of plastic bags rustling and scanners beeping filling the air. Yet the atmosphere around lane 4 was taut, stretched so tightly that even ordinary sounds seemed sharpened. Thomas Garrison shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the worn rubber tip of his cane squeaking faintly against the tiles. His movements were measured, each step deliberate, as though the simple act of pushing his cart forward was a mission in itself. He placed another item on the conveyor belt, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the milk carton. The tremor was not weakness. It was the echo of years carried in his body, injuries that never fully healed. He set it down with care, aligning it squarely with the bread. The precision was instinctive, drilled into him long before the days of supermarkets and checkout lines. Even now, in the face of hostility, order was his shield. Behind him, the woman exhaled dramatically, the sound sharp and theatrical. She shifted her cart forward until it nearly struck the back of his legs again. Her lips curled into a sneer. "You know, some of us don't have all day," she said, her tone pitched high enough to draw glances from those nearby. Her eyes scanned the crowd, daring anyone to challenge her impatience. No one did. A teenager 2 places back chuckled under his breath. He leaned toward his friend, whispering just loud enough to be heard. "Bet it takes him 10 minutes just to swipe his card." The friend snickered, shaking his head, eyes flicking with amusement toward Thomas's trembling hands. Their laughter was small, but it carried like sparks on dry leaves. The man directly behind Thomas muttered something into his phone, his voice curt. Always holding up the line. Figures. He did not mean to be heard, but the words slipped out into the open, another weight pressing down on the moment. Thomas heard, though he gave no sign of it. His face remained steady, his eyes fixed on the counter. He had learned long ago not to flinch at words. He reached for his wallet again, his fingers fumbling slightly against the leather edges. The zipper stuck halfway, worn from decades of use. His hand hesitated, trembled once, then steadied. He pulled it open at last, his breath slow, controlled, as though calming himself against the frustration of failing hands. The bills inside were folded neatly, the coins wrapped in a small square of paper for easier handling. Even here, discipline showed itself in quiet ways. The woman clicked her tongue and shook her head. "Honestly, why do they even let people like this come alone? He needs a babysitter." Her voice was sharper now, each syllable laced with disdain. The cashier froze, glancing up in alarm but said nothing. His hands trembled faintly as he scanned the bread, his eyes darting toward Thomas as if silently apologizing for what he could not control. Thomas did not answer. He did not look at her. He lifted the next can of soup and placed it gently on the counter, stacking it neatly against the first. His silence was not empty. It was full, layered with a dignity that words could not break. The precision of his movements was its own reply, a declaration that he would not be hurried, no matter the jeers. The child in the next lane tugged harder on his mother's hand, whispering again, "Mom, why is she so mean to him?" The mother hushed him quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward the woman, then back at her own groceries. But the question lingered, unanswerable, in the hush that followed. Another sigh came from the impatient woman, louder than before. She tapped her foot rapidly against the tile, the sound rattling like a clock counting down. Her frustration was no longer private. It was performative, aimed at drawing agreement from those around her. And though a few nodded faintly, ashamed to admit their own impatience, most looked away, unwilling to share in her cruelty. Thomas steadied his cane against the counter, freeing his hands for a moment. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, grooves polished by the pressure of his grip. He leaned slightly, easing the weight from his aching hip, his breath controlled, his eyes calm. His silence carried with it the weight of decades. He had endured worse than this, far worse, and though the line of groceries blurred slightly in his vision, he refused to be shaken. The cashier's scanner beeped again, the sound crisp in the heavy quiet. One by one, the items slid down the belt, small and ordinary. Yet each item, each movement, was amplified by the tension pressing in from every side. It was no longer a checkout line. It was a crucible. The woman leaned forward suddenly, her finger jabbing toward Thomas's shoulder, though it stopped just short of touching him. Her voice cut like a blade. "You think the world owes you something just because you wear that hat? Newsflash, it doesn't." Her words echoed across the store, drawing heads from other lanes. The humiliation sharpened, burning brighter with each word. Thomas lifted his final item, the apples, placing them carefully onto the counter. His hands shook more now, but he aligned them just the same. Each apple rested neatly beside the others, their skins polished by his sleeve. His voice, low and steady, slipped through the air almost unnoticed. "Always finish the mission." The words were quiet, not for her, not for the crowd, perhaps not even for the cashier. They were for himself, a reminder. A mantra. A soldier's creed carried into old age. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some avoided looking. Others stared, their expressions heavy with something they couldn't name. Shame, recognition, maybe both. But still, no one stepped forward. The air inside the store felt heavy now, as if every fluorescent light hummed louder, casting a pale glow over faces that no longer looked away. The ordinary rhythm of checkout had slowed to a crawl, replaced by the grating voice of the woman who stood behind Thomas. Her irritation, once petty, now swelled into hostility that demanded the entire store bear witness. She shoved the cart forward again, harder this time. The metal frame slammed into the back of Thomas's legs, and his cane slipped an inch across the tiles. He lurched, catching himself against the counter, his knuckles white with the strain of holding his balance. A collective gasp rippled down the line, a sound too soft to stop her, but too sharp to ignore. Her words cut through the silence like a whip. "I don't care who you are. I don't care what little story you're carrying. You don't get special treatment in the real world." Her voice cracked on the last syllable, pitched high with the kind of anger that feeds on itself. She gestured toward his groceries with a sneer. "Bread and soup? Holding everyone up for that?" The cashier froze mid-scan, his hands trembling as he tried to steady the milk on the counter. His eyes darted toward Thomas, then to the manager across the floor, pleading silently for guidance. The manager looked back, but stayed rooted to his spot, his clipboard forgotten in his hand. No one in authority moved. A man near the magazine rack shifted forward, his mouth opening as though to speak. His voice came halting, uncertain. "Hey, maybe just let the man be." It was the smallest attempt at intervention, a flicker of decency breaking through. But the woman rounded on him immediately, her face red with fury. "Mind your own business," she snapped, her finger stabbing the air toward him. Her voice grew louder, feeding on the silence of the crowd. "You people don't understand. We let this kind of thing slide, and pretty soon everyone thinks they're owed something." Her chest heaved with the force of her words, each sentence pitched as though she were delivering a verdict. The man recoiled, muttering apologies as he stepped back, unwilling to weather the storm of her rage. His retreat only emboldened her. She turned her glare back toward Thomas, her voice dripping with disdain. "Don't stand there acting all noble. You're just slowing everyone down." From the corner of the aisle, a teenager lifted his phone higher, the small lens pointed squarely at Thomas. The glow of the screen reflected off his smirk. "This is going viral," he whispered to his friend. Their muffled laughter added to the chorus of humiliation, sharp and cutting. Thomas adjusted his stance slowly, placing both hands firmly on his cane. His shoulders did not slump. His head did not bow. He simply breathed, long and steady, his silence defying her fury in the only way left to him. His groceries remained neatly aligned on the counter, each piece placed with care, a soldier's order amidst the chaos. The woman's frustration flared hotter at his refusal to react. She leaned closer, her voice harsh and cruel. "What's the matter, old man? Nothing left to say? Or are you just waiting for someone to feel sorry for you?" Her words echoed, and for the first time, some in the crowd flinched openly at her cruelty. The cashier, cheeks pale, whispered softly as he bagged the items. "Please, ma'am, that's enough." But his voice was too soft, barely audible over her tirade. She ignored him completely, her anger consuming the space. Thomas's hand slipped slightly against the cart handle, the faint smear of blood appearing where his skin had scraped against the metal during her shove. The sight drew a murmur from those closest, but still, no one stepped forward. The humiliation, sharper now, pressed against every corner of the store. The child in the next lane buried his face into his mother's side, frightened by the noise. The mother turned away, shielding him, her lips pressed thin with silent disapproval. Yet even she did not speak. The silence of the crowd was its own verdict, one that pressed against Thomas more heavily than her words. And still, he did not bend. His composure did not falter. His silence was a wall she could not breach, though she tried again and again. He stood like an old stone against the storm, blood on his hand, tremor in his fingers, but his back unbroken. The crowd held its breath, waiting for something to shift. The store had grown unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that arrives when cruelty has rung out too loudly and left its echo hanging in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, their hum filling the silence where words had fallen away. Thomas Garrison stood rooted at the checkout, his hand resting on the cane that steadied him, his eyes fixed calmly on the counter. The scrape of blood on his knuckle glistened faintly under the harsh light, but he ignored it. Slowly, with deliberate care, he straightened the items before him. The bread was nudged into line with the milk. The cans of soup stood upright, their labels facing forward. The apples were gathered neatly, their skins gleaming as if polished by invisible hands. Every gesture was precise, every placement intentional. To the impatient crowd it seemed unnecessary, but to Thomas it was everything. Discipline had been his armor once, and it still was now. The woman behind him clicked her tongue, rolling her eyes for all to see. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, her voice loud and cutting. "It's a grocery line, not boot camp." Her laugh rang hollow, a sharp note in the stillness. No one joined her. The silence of the others was beginning to shift, no longer complicit, but waiting, watching. Thomas breathed slowly, his chest rising and falling with the steadiness of a man who had long ago learned to master fear. The words cut, but he did not flinch. His lips moved barely, forming words not meant for anyone but himself. "Always finish the mission." The phrase slipped into the air, soft and steady, spoken with the weight of memory. The cashier froze mid-motion, the bag of apples still in his hands. He had not expected to hear it, yet the words landed with a gravity that silenced even his trembling fingers. He set the bag down gently, his eyes fixed on Thomas with a recognition he could not explain. Behind the counter, the machines beeped in steady rhythm, but the sound no longer seemed mundane. It was a drumbeat to the moment, a reminder of order in the face of chaos. Thomas tapped his cane lightly against the tile floor once, the sound sharp and deliberate. It was not defiance, not aggression, just presence. The small sound carried more weight than the woman's shrill laughter. The crowd began to sense it too, shoulders straightened, eyes lifted. Something about the old man's composure, about the way he aligned each item with quiet patience, spoke louder than any protest could. He was not seeking sympathy. He was not begging for respect. He was simply standing his ground, holding the line as he always had. The woman scoffed, her voice brittle now. "Pathetic," she said, though her tone lacked the strength it had carried before. Her eyes darted toward the others, searching for affirmation that no longer came. The crowd did not laugh, did not nod, did not share her cruelty. The silence was shifting away from her, pulled toward the quiet weight of the man she mocked. Thomas adjusted his cap with slow precision, tugging the brim until it sat square on his head. The gesture was small, but in it lay the habits of decades, the same steadiness he had carried in jungles, on ridges, in places where noise and fear threatened to unmake men. The same steadiness now carried him through a grocery store line. The cashier glanced again toward the manager, but the manager remained frozen, clipboard clutched to his chest, his eyes fixed on Thomas. Even authority seemed unwilling to break the silence. The atmosphere hung heavy, the kind of moment that felt stretched beyond its ordinary limits. And then, at the back of the line, a figure shifted. A man set down his basket quietly on the floor, his arms folded across his chest, his stance too precise to belong to an ordinary shopper. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, eyes steady. He had been watching from the beginning, silent and still. Now his posture spoke louder than words. The time for silence was nearly done. But Thomas did not turn. He did not acknowledge the movement. His composure remained unbroken, his dignity intact. He did not need to look behind him to know when a uniform had entered the room, even if it was worn in plain clothes. His instincts told him the tide was about to shift. And still, he finished his task. The apples, the bread, the soup, all aligned with quiet care. His silence was not surrender. It was strength. It was the old soldier's way of holding the line, no matter how fierce the storm that pressed against it. At the far end of the checkout lane, a man in plain clothes stood with a stillness that did not belong to the chaos of the store. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his arms folded across his chest, with a calm precision that spoke of training. His basket lay on the floor beside him, forgotten. He had been silent from the start, eyes fixed on the old man at the counter, watching each cruel word and shove unfold without interference. Yet his presence alone carried weight. The crowd around him shifted uneasily, sensing something different in the way he stood. It was not defiance, nor anger, but a readiness, the kind that cannot be faked. His gaze never wandered, never flicked away in discomfort like the others. He studied Thomas Garrison as though measuring not just the scene, but the man himself. Every detail mattered. The blood on his hand, the tremor in his fingers, the precision with which he placed each grocery. The woman, still bristling behind Thomas, did not notice him at first. Her focus was locked entirely on the old man she sought to humiliate. She tapped her foot rapidly against the tile, arms crossed tight, her sighs exaggerated and loud. "I shouldn't have to wait for this," she muttered, her voice carrying across the lane. "People like him hold everyone back." Her words, sharp and dripping with disdain, rang hollow now. But she did not see how the tide of silence had shifted against her. The man at the back of the line adjusted his stance slightly, one foot shifting forward, his shoulders tightening. The movement was small, yet it drew eyes. A whisper rippled through the onlookers, quiet and uncertain. Someone recognized the bearing, though they could not place it. He did not need a uniform for people to sense it. The discipline of service lingers long after the uniform is folded away. He stepped forward once, slow and deliberate. His shoes struck the tile with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, a measured rhythm that echoed down the aisle. The shoppers nearest him straightened instinctively, as though reacting to a command they did not hear but felt. Even the cashier's hands faltered, pausing mid-scan as the man drew closer. Thomas did not turn. His eyes remained on his groceries, his cane steady, his breath controlled. But he felt it, the weight of another presence, the unmistakable current of someone who had also known discipline, danger, and silence. Without looking, he knew he was no longer alone. The entitled woman finally noticed the shift. She glanced back over her shoulder, her lips parting in irritation. "What are you staring at?" she snapped, her voice raised again, trying to seize control of the moment. But the man did not answer. He simply stood taller, his arms dropping to his sides, his posture straightening into something unmistakable. His silence was louder than her noise. Her bravado faltered. She shifted her stance, gripping her cart handle more tightly as though it could anchor her. She looked around, seeking agreement. But the eyes of the crowd no longer met hers. Their attention had moved, drawn instead to the quiet figure who now stepped closer to Thomas, his gaze never wavering. The hum of the store seemed to change. The beeps of the registers felt distant, the shuffle of carts muted. All sound bent toward the weight of the silence between the woman's hostility and the man's steady watch. The air was no longer filled with her voice alone. It was balanced now, held by something deeper, older, and far more commanding. The manager at the service desk took a step forward, hesitated, then stopped. He too felt it, the presence that suggested authority beyond his own clipboard and badge. He did not interfere. He could not. The space belonged to something larger now. Thomas finally placed his last item on the counter, his hand lingering for a moment on the apples. His shoulders straightened, and though he did not turn, a flicker of calm moved across his features. He knew. The watcher had revealed himself, not with words, not with confrontation, but with the simple act of standing. And the store, once filled with impatience and mockery, began to sense that the balance of power had shifted. The air inside the grocery store was so still that even the faint crackle of the intercom seemed to echo. Lane 4 had ceased to feel like a line of shoppers. It had become a stage, every person holding their breath, waiting for the next act to unfold. The woman, emboldened by the silence that had once shielded her, leaned forward again, her words sharp enough to sting. "You people think the world owes you something." Her voice cracked with anger, reaching a pitch that startled even herself. The sound rattled against the walls and left a hollow quiet in its wake. Thomas Garrison did not flinch. His shoulders remained steady, his cane planted firmly against the floor, his eyes lowered to the counter where his carefully aligned groceries rested in quiet order. His silence was his armor, his refusal to descend into the noise. But the weight pressing on him was heavy, not just from her words, but from the gaze of the crowd, from the humiliation of being made a spectacle when all he wanted was bread, milk, and apples. It was then that the man from the back of the line stepped forward. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, each footfall striking the tile with a certainty that drew every eye. He passed other shoppers without glancing at them, his focus fixed solely on the old soldier at the counter. His basket remained forgotten, left behind on the floor where he had set it, as though its contents no longer mattered. What mattered was here, now. He reached the front and stopped directly behind Thomas. For a moment he did nothing, only standing tall, his presence filling the space. Then he bent slowly, picking up Thomas's cane from where it had slipped slightly askew earlier under the shove of the cart. He held it carefully, reverently, as though it were something more than wood, and without a word, he placed it back into Thomas's hand, his fingers steady, his expression solemn. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the force of recognition. The air shifted. The crowd felt it immediately, though no words explained it. This was no ordinary shopper. This was a man who understood exactly what Thomas represented and why his silence mattered. When Thomas accepted the cane, his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. His eyes, still lowered, flickered faintly, as though acknowledging something without speech. A line had been drawn, not with noise, but with dignity. The woman stared, her expression faltering. "What is this? Some kind of performance?" she snapped, though her voice had lost some of its edge. She looked around desperately, seeking support, but found only silence. The laughter of the teenagers had died. The whispers of impatience were gone. All eyes had shifted, drawn to the quiet strength of the man who now stood at Thomas's back. He did not answer her. He did not need to. His posture was enough. He placed his empty hands behind his back, feet shoulder-width apart, his spine straight as a rod. The stance was unmistakable to anyone who had ever served, and even those who had not felt the weight of its meaning. He was not here to argue. He was here to stand. The cashier's hands trembled as he slid another item across the scanner. The beep sounded louder than before, as though it marked not just groceries, but a shift in the entire room. His eyes darted between the two men, his breath catching in his chest. The young man recognized something that words could not explain, something carried in posture, in silence, in the invisible thread between the old soldier and the one now at his side. The woman huffed, her face reddening. She tried again, her voice sharp. "What? Are you his bodyguard now?" But her words landed flat, met not with approval, but with the heavy silence of a crowd no longer on her side. The stillness in the store was no longer complicity. It was respect. Thomas adjusted his grip on the cane, his shoulders rising with a breath that carried decades of memory. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his back. For the first time that afternoon, he lifted his eyes from the counter. The old soldier no longer stood alone, and the entire store knew it. The silence after the woman's last outburst was deep enough to hear the hum of the refrigerators at the back of the store. Even the registers, once steady in their chorus of beeps, seemed to hesitate, as if the machines themselves were reluctant to intrude upon what was happening. Thomas Garrison stood motionless, his cane firm in his hand, his posture straightened by quiet pride. The younger man behind him had not moved since returning the cane. He simply stood, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, eyes fixed on the same horizon that only soldiers can see. Thomas turned slightly, the motion slow but steady, his eyes lifting until they met the man's. For a moment, no words passed between them, yet something profound did. An unspoken recognition carved from shared experience, from a lifetime of understanding what it means to endure without applause. Their gaze held steady, unbroken, as if time had folded and the noise of the store fell away. The younger man's jaw tightened just slightly, the smallest movement betraying a tide of emotion held firmly in check. His eyes, dark and steady, studied the older soldier's face, the lines of exhaustion, the tremor in his hands, the quiet discipline that had not faded with age. What he saw there was not frailty, but strength, the kind of strength that never asks to be seen, yet demands to be remembered. Thomas's lips moved barely, forming two quiet words that trembled in the air between them. "Firebase Gloria?" The younger man blinked once, a flicker of recognition sparking in his expression. He nodded slowly, just once. No smile, no salute, only that single gesture of affirmation. It was all the confirmation that was needed. The words carried a memory too heavy for casual speech. A place, a time, a shared hell known only to those who had survived it or heard it whispered through the generations. A faint exhale escaped Thomas, not quite a sigh, not quite relief. His hand tightened briefly on the cane, his shoulders easing as though a long-held weight had shifted. The air between them changed, no longer heavy with humiliation but anchored by mutual respect. Around them, the crowd began to stir faintly, but not with noise. The energy had transformed. The cashier's eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion as he looked from one man to the other, sensing the gravity of what had passed, though he could not fully understand it. The young mother with the child in the next lane wiped her eyes quickly, pretending to busy herself with her receipt. Even the teenagers, phones still in their hands, had lowered them now, their faces pale with the realization that they had witnessed something sacred. The woman who had been shouting stood frozen in place. The words she had been ready to unleash next died in her throat. Her eyes flicked between the two men, searching for some explanation for the quiet power that now filled the room. She could not name it, but she could feel it. The certainty that whatever battle she had been trying to win had already been lost, not through argument, but through dignity. The younger man shifted his weight slightly, just enough to stand directly beside Thomas now. The space between them closed, and for a moment, they looked less like strangers and more like soldiers waiting for a command. The alignment was natural, unconscious. 2 generations of service standing shoulder to shoulder. Thomas gave a faint nod, the movement barely perceptible but loaded with meaning. It said everything words could not. You did right to stand. You understood. The younger man returned the nod. His voice came at last, quiet but strong enough to carry to the nearby registers. You held the line then, he said softly, and you're still holding it now. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a salute. The crowd heard them and fell utterly silent again, as if language itself had become too small for what the moment deserved. For the first time, Thomas smiled, just barely, not from pride, but from recognition. It was not gratitude in his eyes, but understanding. This was the brotherhood that never faded, not with age, not with distance, not with the years that separate one war from another. It lived in gestures, in silence, in the way one man stands when another is threatened. And for those watching, it was as though a light had shifted inside the store. They did not know the place called Firebase Gloria. They did not know the smell of rain-soaked uniforms or the sound of distant shell fire. But they could feel the truth of it, that the old man before them had earned his dignity long ago, and that the world had forgotten how to see it until now. No one spoke. No one dared to break the fragile stillness. It was enough to witness it, to see 2 soldiers share the kind of acknowledgement that transcends apology, explanation, or words. And in that silence, the store began to change. The silence stretched long enough for the hum of the fluorescent lights to fill every corner of the store. No one moved. The world outside, the soft whine of car tires in the parking lot, the hum of the air vents, seemed to fade into nothing. Inside that small, ordinary grocery store, something sacred hung in the air. The younger man's eyes stayed on Thomas. There was no hesitation now, no question left in his face. His voice, when it came, was steady but heavy, each word measured like a step taken on sacred ground. "You think he's holding up the line?" he said, his tone calm yet commanding enough that even those at the end of the aisles turned to listen. "This man once held the line when no one else could." The woman froze, her face paling. The anger she had carried drained out of her in an instant, replaced by confusion, then something closer to fear. The words had cut through all her noise. The crowd turned toward the speaker, drawn to his voice like iron to a magnet. The younger man stepped closer, his boots clicking softly against the tile. His eyes never left Thomas. "My father told me about a man like you," he said, quieter now, though the words carried as though the room had leaned in to hear them. "He said there was a night in the jungle, a night when everything went wrong, communications down, supplies gone, surrounded on all sides. They thought no one would make it out, but one man refused to pull back." He paused, his jaw tightening, the memory visible in his expression. He carried 3 wounded men over a ridge under fire. He walked for 18 hours without rest, using his own shirt to bind a comrade's leg. They said his boots fell apart, that he walked the last mile barefoot. Gasps rippled quietly through the crowd. The cashier's hands stopped moving entirely, his eyes fixed wide in disbelief. The woman's grip on her cart loosened, the metal rattling faintly as her strength drained from it. The younger man's voice softened but deepened in tone, as though each word carried weight from generations of remembrance. "That man's name was Thomas Garrison. My father said he never got the recognition he deserved. He said the paperwork went missing, the commendation never came. But the men who survived, those who lived because of him, they remembered. My father was one of them." The old soldier's hand tightened around the handle of his cane. His head tilted slightly, his eyes glinting under the harsh white light. There was no pride in his face, no shock, only quiet acknowledgement. The story was true, though he had never told it himself. The young man took another slow step forward until he stood directly beside him, his voice lowering to something almost reverent. "You saved my father's life. He used to tell me that when he thought of courage, he didn't picture medals or parades. He pictured you." Thomas's breath caught for the briefest moment, a flicker of memory moving behind his eyes. The rain, the smell of wet earth, the sound of men calling through the dark. He remembered the ridge, the cries, the silence that followed. And now, decades later, standing in a grocery store under buzzing lights, the ghosts of that night had come home through the voice of another man's son. His response came low, nearly a whisper. "We all just did what we had to do." The younger man shook his head slightly. "You did more than that." The woman behind them swallowed hard, her face ashen. The arrogance that had burned so brightly minutes ago had vanished, leaving only a tremor in her voice. I didn't know," she stammered. Her eyes darted toward Thomas, then to the others, as if searching for a way to undo the moment. "I didn't mean—" But the words trailed off. There was no excuse large enough to fill the silence she had created. The crowd's gaze, once full of judgment, now rested on her with quiet reproach. Not anger, something deeper. Disappointment. Thomas's hand rose slightly, stopping her apology before it could finish. His voice was calm, tired, but unbroken. "You still don't know," he said softly. "And that's not the point." His words carried a gravity that settled over the room like a benediction. It was not bitterness that drove them, but truth, the kind that cannot be argued with, the kind earned through pain, endurance, and decades of living quietly in a world that had long since forgotten. The woman pressed her lips together, tears rising in her eyes. She nodded once, unable to look at him again. The young man remained beside Thomas, his stance unwavering. Together they stood, one carrying memory, the other carrying gratitude. And for the first time that day, Everyone in the store understood. The man they had pitied, ignored, or scorned was not fragile. He was not slow. He was not lesser. He was the living embodiment of something larger than all of them, something quiet, steadfast, and almost lost to time. A heavy stillness filled the space, sacred and unspoken. The air itself seemed to bow around them. For several long seconds, no one in the store moved. It was as though time itself had drawn to a stop around lane 4, holding every breath in suspension. The sound of the world outside was lost to the silence within, broken only by the faint hum of the lights above and the distant whir of the freezer fans. Every face in the aisle was turned toward the old soldier, who stood quietly at the register, his cane planted firmly on the tile, his presence suddenly larger than the small space that contained him. The manager, who had been standing frozen near the service desk, set his clipboard down slowly. His usual brisk managerial composure had melted away, replaced by something heavier, a mixture of guilt and awe. He stepped forward, the rubber soles of his shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. Each step seemed to echo against the silence, drawing the eyes of the staff and customers alike. When he reached the checkout counter, he stopped beside the young cashier, who stood pale and rigid, still holding the last item of Thomas's groceries in his hands. The manager cleared his throat, though his voice, when it came, was softer than anyone expected. "Mr. Garrison," he began, his tone careful, uncertain. "I didn't know." Thomas gave a faint shake of his head. "You weren't supposed to," he said simply. His words carried no accusation, no resentment, only truth. The strength of it was quiet, but it filled the room. The younger man beside Thomas straightened, his posture still firm. The sight of the two men standing shoulder to shoulder had changed the air entirely. No longer was this a scene of humiliation. It was a lesson, a reckoning, and a kind of ceremony all at once. The manager swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "No one like you," he said slowly, "should ever have to wait in this line again." He turned, looking back toward the staff gathered behind the registers. "From this day forward," he said, his voice gathering steadiness, "veterans go first, always, no exceptions." His eyes moved over his employees, one by one. "And if anyone gives them less than the respect they deserve, they answer to me." The cashier blinked rapidly, his eyes glistening. He nodded, a single firm motion, as though sealing the promise in place. Around them, other employees stood straighter, their faces solemn. Even the bagger at the far end of the aisle, who had been frozen in place holding a half-filled paper sack, slowly set it down and raised his chin in quiet agreement. The woman who had started it all stood several steps back, her shoulders slumped, her hands gripping the handle of her cart as if to steady herself. The redness in her face had drained away, leaving behind only a pale, ashen look. Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. She could not. The magnitude of what she had done, the disrespect she had unleashed, pressed down on her like a physical weight. The crowd, once a passive audience to cruelty, had shifted entirely. A middle-aged man near the magazines nodded solemnly, as if in salute. A teenager who had been recording the incident with his phone slowly lowered it, then slipped it back into his pocket, ashamed of his own curiosity. A young mother placed a hand on her child's shoulder, leaning close to whisper, "Remember him. Always remember." The manager stepped around the counter and took the small pile of groceries that Thomas had so carefully arranged. He began to ring them through himself, scanning each item with deliberate care. When Thomas reached for his wallet, the manager raised a hand gently to stop him. "No," he said quietly. "Not today. Not ever again. This one's on us." Thomas hesitated, his fingers still against the worn leather of his wallet. Pride and humility warred silently in his eyes. He had never taken charity, never asked for favors, but something in the man's tone, something in the solemn sincerity of the moment, made him pause. Slowly, he let the wallet fall closed again. The younger man beside him turned slightly, his voice low but carrying. "Sir," he said, addressing the manager, It's not about free groceries. It's about remembering. Just make sure no one forgets. The manager nodded. They won't, he said simply. Not anymore. The young cashier finished bagging the last of the items, his hands steady now. He placed them carefully into the brown paper bag, folding the top over twice with precise care before sliding it toward Thomas. His voice came soft, trembling at the edges. "Thank you, sir," he said, "for everything." Thomas took the bag in his good hand, balancing it against the handle of his cane. He did not speak, but his eyes met the young man's, and that was enough. Gratitude, pride, humility, all of it passed silently in that look. Around them, the murmurs began again, not whispers of gossip or irritation, but quiet affirmations. Someone near the end of the aisle whispered, "God bless him." Another murmured, "About time someone stood up." The sound spread like a low, reverent wave, not applause, but something far deeper. Acknowledgement. The woman who had mocked him stepped forward, trembling slightly. Her voice came small, cracking. "I'm sorry," she said. It was barely audible, almost swallowed by the hum of the store, but Thomas heard it. He turned toward her, his gaze steady. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he gave a slow nod, neither absolution nor condemnation, just understanding. That was mercy enough. As he turned toward the doors, the younger man fell in step beside him. Together, they walked through the aisle that had moments ago been filled with noise and impatience. Now, people moved aside in silence, giving them space, their eyes following with quiet reverence. When they reached the entrance, the automatic doors opened with a soft sigh. Sunlight spilled across the floor, bright and golden, casting long shadows behind them. Thomas stepped into it, the weight of the bag steady in his hand, his cane tapping once against the threshold before the light swallowed him. Inside, no one spoke for a long while. Then the manager turned to the cashier and said quietly, "Put up a sign." His voice carried a rare kind of conviction. Right by the entrance, big letters. The cashier nodded. What should it say? The manager looked toward the door where Thomas had just exited, the sunlight still glowing faintly against the glass. "It should say," he answered, "Veterans first, always." And as the store slowly returned to motion, something unspoken remained in the air, a presence, a promise, a quiet shift in the way people saw one another. The line had moved on, but the world inside that store would never be quite the same again. 1 week later, the afternoon light slanted through the wide front windows of the same grocery store, painting long golden lines across the polished tile floor. The hum of the refrigerators was the same, the steady rhythm of checkout beeps unchanged, yet there was something different in the air, a softness, an awareness that lingered just beneath the noise of everyday life. The people who worked there carried it with them now, a quiet weight that had settled after the day the world had stopped inside those aisles. Thomas Garrison's cane tapped gently against the floor as he entered, his figure small but upright against the flow of shopping carts and chatter. The automatic doors sighed open to let him in, and for a brief moment, the sunlight followed him like an old friend. The customers closest to the entrance stepped aside instinctively, not out of fear or awkwardness, but with a subtle nod of respect that had not existed a week before. He moved slowly through the aisles, his pace steady, his movements careful. The same groceries filled his basket: bread, milk, soup, and apples, the staples of quiet living. He did not expect to be recognized, nor did he seek acknowledgement. He came because this was his routine, and discipline had always been his anchor. But as he passed the registers, something caught his eye. Mounted near the front counter, gleaming faintly under the store's harsh lights, was a sign. The letters were clean and bold, printed on fresh white plastic. "Veterans first, always." He paused, studying it for a moment, his weathered hand resting on the handle of his cart. It was simple, unadorned, yet it carried more meaning than any medal could. A gesture not of pity, but of remembrance. Behind the counter, the same young cashier who had been frozen with fear that day now looked up and caught his gaze, his face lit with recognition. He straightened his posture unconsciously, the same way soldiers stand a little taller when they see someone who reminds them of what discipline looks like. "Good afternoon, Mr. Garrison," the cashier said quietly, almost reverently. His voice had lost its tremor, replaced now by confidence, steadiness. "You don't have to wait in line. We've got a lane open for you." Thomas smiled faintly, a slow, genuine smile that reached the corners of his tired eyes. "That's kind of you," he said, his voice low and measured. "But I can wait my turn." The cashier hesitated, then nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. The old soldier wasn't refusing respect. He was honoring the normalcy that others took for granted. That was his way of teaching without speeches. As Thomas began placing his groceries on the belt, a familiar sound reached his ears, the tap of boots against tile. He turned slightly and saw the younger man from that day, the one who had stood beside him, walking down the aisle with a basket in hand. He wore no uniform, yet everything about him still carried the bearing of one. His steps were measured, his gaze direct, and when he reached the register beside Thomas, he stopped. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The noise of the store faded again into something distant, like a tide rolling softly against the shore. Then the younger man gave a short nod, the kind that carried the weight of an oath. "Sir," he said simply. Thomas returned the nod, equally spare in gesture, equally full of meaning. "Son," he replied, his voice quiet but warm. It was a greeting, a farewell, and a benediction all at once. The younger man placed his few items on the belt, but his attention lingered on Thomas, the older man whose story had changed more than just a policy. It had changed how people saw each other, how they recognized the quiet battles carried by those who walked among them unseen. As the cashier finished bagging the groceries, a soft voice came from behind. The sound was hesitant, uncertain. Thomas turned slightly and saw her, the woman who had once shoved his cart and filled the air with cruelty. She stood a few paces away, her hands clutching a small envelope. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady, her face drawn with humility rather than pride. She stepped forward slowly, extending the envelope toward him. "I wanted to give you this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not much, just something I wrote. I didn't know who you were, I didn't see." Thomas took the envelope, his expression unreadable. The paper was soft from being held too tightly, creased at the corners. He nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. "Thank you," he said simply. She hesitated a moment longer, her throat tightening as if more words wanted to come but couldn't find their way out. Then she stepped back, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Thomas's answer was a single, slow nod. "You learned," he said quietly. "That's what matters." She left before the tears could fall. The younger man behind Thomas watched her go, then looked at the old soldier again. "You handled that better than most of us could," he said softly. Thomas adjusted his cap, the brim shadowing his eyes. "Life's too short to fight ghosts," he murmured. The cashier handed him his bag of groceries, double-bagged with care. Thomas thanked him with a small nod and turned toward the doors. The sunlight beyond the glass glowed deep and warm, and when the doors opened, it poured over him like an embrace. The cane tapped once against the threshold, and he stepped out into the fading light. Behind him, the store hummed back to life. People spoke more softly, smiled more often, moved with a touch more patience. A small change, almost invisible, but real. The world had not transformed overnight, but something essential had shifted in the hearts of those who had been there that day. Outside, Thomas paused beside the bench near the parking lot. The breeze stirred the hem of his jacket, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and asphalt. He set the grocery bag beside him, rested both hands atop his cane, and looked up at the sky. The clouds were drifting apart, sunlight spilling through in thin golden rays. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass behind him. An old soldier sitting quietly, his head bowed, his spirit at ease. For the first time in a long while, he felt the peace that comes not from being honored, but from being understood. If stories like this resonate with your heart, Like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we will walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.